The conference room smelled like recycled air and old carpet. The judge had the printout centered in front of her. She read it once, silently, and then she read it aloud into the record. "We took your 5 million and we're in the Maldives. Don't bother calling." My mother sent me that text while I was still in uniform. But to understand what happened in that room, you need to know who I was before. My name is Mara Caldwell. I was 34 years old when all of this happened, and I had been a staff sergeant with the 2nd Battalion of the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, for just under 7 years. Before that, I did a tour in Afghanistan and one in Kuwait, and before that, I grew up in a 3-bedroom house in Flagstaff, Arizona, where my father was a civil engineer who had spent 30 years quietly accumulating something he never talked about. He did not talk about it because he was that kind of man. He drove a 9-year-old pickup truck. He bought store-brand cereal. He kept a legal pad on the kitchen counter where he wrote down every expense over $5, and he had done that every single week since before I was born. I know this because I still have 63 of those legal pads. They are in a box in my garage right now. What my father had accumulated by the time he died was a portfolio of index funds, 2 rental properties in Flagstaff, a paid-off house, and a life insurance policy, totaling just over $5 million. He had never told me the exact number. I found out the same way everyone else did, from the will, read aloud by the family attorney in a conference room in Flagstaff, in January of 2022. I was not at that reading. I was at Fort Campbell. I was 2 weeks out from a deployment cycle, and my unit was running logistics exercises in 40-degree weather. And I told myself I would fly out as soon as the cycle ended. My mother said that was fine. She said she would handle everything. She was the executor. My father had named her executor of his estate 6 years earlier when they were still married, and nobody had thought to update that after the divorce. That was the first mistake. Not mine. His. And it cost me everything he had spent 30 years building. I kept a photograph of him on my nightstand at the barracks since my first deployment. It was taken at a camping trip in the White Mountains when I was 11. He is holding a compass in the picture, squinting at it like he does not entirely trust it. I still have that photograph. I still keep it in the same spot. I had no reason to think anything was wrong. That was the problem. My mother's name is Diane. She is 61 years old, and she has always been the kind of woman who makes every room feel smaller by being in it. Not through malice exactly, but through the particular energy of someone who has never quite stopped competing. When I was a kid, she coached my soccer team, and she was genuinely good at it. She knew the game, and she pushed us hard, and she celebrated every win like it was her own. That is the honest version of my mother. I want to say it because it is true, and because what came after does not make sense without it. My sister Kelsey is 4 years younger than me and lives in Scottsdale. She has a real estate license she uses occasionally and a boyfriend she has been about to marry for 6 years. Kelsey and I were never close in the way some sisters are, but we were fine. Family holidays were fine. We texted about our dad when he got sick. She sent me care packages during my second deployment, the practical kind, with sunscreen and instant coffee and a paperback novel. I read all 300 pages of that novel in one night because I was bored and it was there. I still think about that sometimes. My father got his diagnosis in the summer of 2020, pancreatic cancer, stage 3. He told me on a Sunday afternoon over the phone, and he said it the way he said everything difficult, which was quickly and without decoration. I cried after I hung up. He probably did not. For the next 18 months, I flew home when I could. I sat with him in the hospital. I drove him to his appointments when my mother could not. My mother was, by that point, 3 years divorced from my father, but they had maintained a civil relationship, the kind that forms when two people are too exhausted to remain enemies. She came to his appointments too. She made his house warm again in those last months. I watched her do it and I thought, she is a better person than I gave her credit for. I should have looked more carefully at what I was watching. There were small things. My father mentioned once that Diane had been helping him review his accounts. He said it casually, the way you mention the weather. I did not ask follow-up questions. There was a phone call in October of 2021 where my mother told me the attorney had suggested updating some of the estate paperwork, and my father had agreed, and it was just routine. I said, okay. I was prepping for a field exercise, and I had 17 other things demanding my attention, and she was the executor, and it was just routine. There was a conversation between Kelsey and my father sometime that November that my father mentioned to me and then moved past so quickly I almost missed it. He said, quote, when I asked what about, he said, quote, 2. I found out later what that conversation was about. I found out what quote 3 meant. I was at Fort Campbell on the 14th of January, 2022, when my father passed away quietly in his own bed in Flagstaff. My unit commander gave me emergency leave. I flew home. I stood at my father's grave in weather that was cold and clear and completely still, and I held that feeling the way you hold something you do not want to put down. My mother stood on one side of me. Kelsey stood on the other. We were, in that moment, a family. 3 weeks later, my mother sent me a text. The text arrived on February 7th, at 6:43 in the morning. I was in the parking lot of the commissary at Fort Campbell, sitting in my car with a coffee that had gone cold. My phone was on the passenger seat, and it lit up with my mother's name. I picked it up. I read it. Underscore, underscore, quote underscore 4, underscore, underscore. I remember reading it twice. I remember the coffee cup in my hand. I remember the parking lot lights were still on because the sun was only just coming up. And the light was that particular orange that makes everything look like a painting of itself. My hands did not shake. That surprised me later, thinking about it. They just went very still, the way they do at the range when I'm about to squeeze a trigger. I sat there for 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I looked at the time when I read the text, and I looked at the time again when I started the car. In those 4 minutes, I did not call her. I did not text back. I sat there and I thought, with a precision that I recognize now as the particular clarity that comes after a very large shock, about what I actually knew and what I did not know, and what I would need to find out. Then I drove back to the barracks, changed out of my PT gear, and called my father's attorney. His name was Gerald Pham. He had handled my father's estate documents for 9 years. He picked up on the second ring, and when I told him what the text said, there was a pause that told me everything before he said a single word. He told me the estate had been liquidated. He told me my mother, acting as executor, had been granted power of attorney over my father's financial accounts 18 months earlier, citing my father's declining health. He told me that over the following 14 months, the accounts had been drawn down, transferred, and closed. He told me the 2 rental properties had been sold in November of 2021 via quitclaim deed to a limited liability company registered in Kelsey's name. He told me the estate, as of the date of my father's death, contained $11,000. I said, quote, 5. He said, quote, 6. I called my mother at 7:22 in the morning. She picked up. In the background I could hear something, wind or water. She sounded relaxed. I asked her to explain what had happened to the estate. She said, underscore underscore, quote, underscore 7, underscore underscore. I did not say anything for a moment. She said, underscore underscore, quote underscore 8, underscore underscore. Then she told me it was almost noon where she was, and she had a lunch reservation. I hung up. I sat on the edge of my bunk, and I looked at the photograph of my father on the nightstand, the one from the camping trip. Him squinting at the compass in the White Mountains. I thought about the legal pads in his kitchen. I thought about 30 years of store-brand cereal. There was something my mother had not considered. The power of attorney had been prepared by a different law firm. That firm had a name. That name was on a document somewhere. And documents do not go on vacation. But there was one more thing I did not know yet. Something that made what my mother had already done look almost small by comparison. Kelsey had filed paperwork to be named primary beneficiary of my father's estate in December of 2021, 3 weeks before he died. They had done this before, not to me, to someone else. They had no idea what they had just done. And I was going to let them keep not knowing, for a while. Now, I want to be clear about where I was at this point. I was a staff sergeant at Fort Campbell with a deployment cycle starting in 6 weeks. I had $11,000 sitting in an estate that should have held $5 million. I had a text message from my mother that read back to me like a receipt. And I had one piece of information nobody had meant to give me: the name of the law firm that prepared the power of attorney. I had not slept in 22 hours. I was running on cold coffee and the kind of focus that shuts everything else down. I had been trained to operate in conditions where panic is wasted movement, and I had no movement to waste. Because what I was about to find out would make the 5 million look like the surface of something much deeper. The first call I made that was not to Gerald Pham was to a woman named Lieutenant Colonel Renata Osei, retired, who had been my battalion commander's battalion commander, and who now ran a veterans legal advocacy organization out of Nashville, Tennessee. I had her number because she had given it to me 3 years earlier after a briefing on service member financial protections, and she had said, "If you ever need it, use it." I had kept it in my phone under Osei, use if needed. I used it. She picked up on the fourth ring. I told her what I had. The text, the power of attorney, the quitclaim deed. The LLC in Kelsey's name. The $11,000 in a $5 million estate. There was a brief silence. Then she said, quote, _1, 0, _. I told her I already had it. Harmon and Associates, Scottsdale, Arizona. She said, quote, 11. She said it the way someone says a thing when it is not interesting at all, but rather exactly what they expected. Quote, 12, quote. I said, quote, 13, quote. She said, quote, 14, quote. That was the beginning of the most methodical 5 weeks of my life, and I have spent 7 years in the United States Army. I started with the county recorder's office in Coconino County, Arizona, where my father's properties were registered, public records, available to anyone with a computer and enough patience to navigate a government database. I pulled the deed transfers on both rental properties. The first had been transferred on November 9th of 2021, the second on November 22nd, both transferred to a limited liability company called KD Property Holdings, registered in the state of Arizona. The registered agent for KD Property Holdings was Kelsey Diane Caldwell. The transfer prices on both deeds were listed at $1 each. I want you to understand what that means. My father's 2 rental properties in Flagstaff were appraised at a combined value of $840,000. They were transferred by my mother acting as power of attorney to my sister's LLC for $1 each. This is a legal instrument called a quitclaim deed. It requires no money to change hands. It requires only a signature from the person authorized to sign. My mother was authorized to sign. I printed both deeds and put them in a manila folder. I labeled the folder with a black marker. That is a habit from the Army. You label everything. The next piece came from the Arizona Corporation Commission, which maintains a public database of every business entity registered in the state. KD Property Holdings had been registered on October 3rd of 2021, 6 weeks before the first property transfer, 2 months before my father died. The registered date went into the folder. The investment accounts were more complicated. Gerald Pham provided me with the account statements he had on file. which showed the balances as of my father's last documented review in the spring of 2021. $3.2 million across 4 brokerage accounts. I requested the transfer history from each institution directly, as a surviving heir, and 2 of the 4 responded within the week. The transfers had begun in August of 2021. They had been made in increments small enough to avoid automatic reporting thresholds. 17 transfers over 14 weeks, each between $18,000 and $22,000, each routed to a joint account held by Diane Caldwell and Kelsey Caldwell at a bank in Scottsdale. Renata Osei looked at those transfer records and said, "They structured them. That is not accidental. Someone told them the reporting threshold." I asked who would know that. She said, "An attorney would know that." I pulled the records for Harmon and Associates. The firm was legitimate, 12 years in operation, specializing in estate planning and asset protection. I was not going to find anything wrong with the firm itself. But the name on the power of attorney document, the attorney who had notarized it and filed it, was a junior associate named Bradley Croft, who had been with the firm for 2 years. I wrote his name down. Then I called the Coconino County Probate Court and asked whether the estate of Raymond Allen Caldwell had been filed for probate review. The clerk checked. She said no filing had been initiated. I thanked her, and I noted the date of the call. That same afternoon, I got a phone call from a number I did not recognize. It was a woman named Patricia Odom. She was 67 years old, she told me, and she had been my father's next-door neighbor on Ponderosa Lane for 11 years. She had found my contact information through Gerald Pham's office, and she had something she thought I should know. She said my mother had come to visit my father in October of 2021. She said it was not a single visit, but a series of them, 3 or 4 over 2 weeks, and that Patricia had seen her arrive each time carrying a leather folder. She said my father had looked in those weeks very tired, and that on one occasion, Patricia had brought over soup, which was her habit with him, and she had heard raised voices through the door before she knocked. She said, "I don't want to be dramatic, but I kept a little diary. I have for years. I wrote down what I saw because it felt like something I should write down. I don't know if it helps." I told her it helped. I asked if I could have a copy. She mailed it to me in a priority mail envelope. 11 pages, handwritten in blue ink, precise dates and times, the kind of record you get from someone who has paid attention to the world for 67 years. Her entry for October 19th read, "Dee arrived at 6 p.m. Ray looked unwell when he answered the door. Heard her say, 'Just sign it, it doesn't change anything.' Stayed 2 hours. I added Patricia Odom's diary to the folder. The following week, Kelsey's boyfriend, a man named Travis, who I had met 4 times and whose last name I could not have told you, sent me an email through my father's estate address, which Gerald Pham was still monitoring. The email said that Kelsey and Diane were, quote, 19, and that I should consider that going forward with a probate challenge would be, quote, 20, and that they were, quote, 21. I read the email once. I wrote back 3 sentences. I said, "The estate is worth $5 million. This offer does not reflect that, and I will not be settling." That is when I pulled the Arizona State Bar records for Bradley Croft, the attorney who had prepared the power of attorney. And that is when I saw the date. The power of attorney had been notarized on October 21st, 2021. 2 days after Patricia Odom had written __, _22 _ in her diary. I had to sit down. I want to pause here for a second, because at this point I had everything I needed. Every document, every transfer record, every date. I had a diary entry from a neighbor who had no reason to lie and every reason to stay out of it. I had an LLC registered before my father died and deeds transferred for $1 each. I had structured withdrawals that somebody with legal knowledge had designed. I had built something that could not be argued with. And I remember Renata Osei looking at me across the table at her office in Nashville 3 days before the hearing and saying, They are going to walk into that room completely confident. Let them. And I understood exactly what she meant, because I had been in rooms like that before, and I knew what confidence looks like right before it breaks. But there is one thing I have not told you yet. One document that arrived in the mail 11 days before the probate hearing. From a law office in Phoenix I had never contacted. It was a letter from an attorney representing the estate of a woman named Gloria Fuentes. She had been my mother's aunt. She had died in 2017. And her estate, which had included a house and a brokerage account valued at roughly $400,000, had been administered by Diane Caldwell, acting as executor, and had been distributed in full to Diane Caldwell and Kelsey Caldwell, with nothing going to Gloria's 2 adult children, who had been listed as beneficiaries in an earlier version of the will. The earlier version of the will had been superseded by a new one, signed 6 weeks before Gloria died, prepared by Harmon and Associates of Scottsdale, Arizona, notarized by Bradley Croft. She had done this before. This was not the first time. I called Renata Osei. I read her the letter over the phone. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, quote underscore 23, underscore. I had one meeting left. And I had been waiting for it for 11 weeks. Everything I had done for the past 3 months had been preparation for one room, one table, one conversation. My attorney, Gerald Pham, had filed the probate challenge on my behalf in Coconino County. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Renata Osei would be present as a consultant. We had submitted our evidence package to the court 5 business days in advance, as required, and I had spent the weekend before rereading every document in the order I had obtained it, making sure I knew the shape of the whole thing from any direction. On the night before the hearing, I sat in my hotel room in Flagstaff and looked at the photograph of my father on my phone. The one from the White Mountains, the compass. My mother and Kelsey did not know about Gloria Fuentes. They did not know about Patricia Odom's diary. They knew I had filed a challenge. They believed it was the action of a grieving daughter without legal standing and without evidence. Their attorney had told them as much, I later learned, because their attorney was also Bradley Croft, which was a decision that said everything about how confident they were. We pulled into the parking garage at 8:47 in the morning. I remember checking the time. The probate courtroom in Flagstaff was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling on the walls, fluorescent lighting, a window on the north side that looked out onto a parking structure. It smelled like old paper and the particular staleness of a room that gets used twice a week and aired out for neither. There were 6 chairs on each side of the central table. A raised bench at the front for the judge, the Honorable Carolyn Swick, who had been on the Coconino County bench for 14 years according to the court's website, and who had, according to Renata Osei, a reputation for reading documents very carefully and tolerating nonsense not at all. I wore my dress uniform. I had thought about that choice for 3 days. Not for theater, because my father had been proud of it, and because I wanted one thing in that room that was entirely mine. My mother was already seated when I walked in. She was wearing a cream blazer and she had her hair done. Kelsey was beside her in a gray dress, and Bradley Croft was at the end of their side of the table in a suit that was slightly too large for him. My mother looked up when I entered. Her expression shifted in a way I cannot describe precisely, except to say that something left it. Not the confidence, not yet, but something around the edges. Gerald Pham sat on my left. Renata Osei sat beside him as a consulting advisor. I sat down, placed my folder on the table in front of me, and folded my hands on top of it. Bradley Croft opened the proceedings with a prepared statement arguing that the estate had been administered lawfully under a valid power of attorney, that all asset transfers had been conducted with the full knowledge and consent of Raymond Caldwell, and that the challenge being brought was without merit and motivated by a daughter who had been, in his words, largely absent from her father's life in his final years. He said largely absent twice. My mother nodded while he spoke. Kelsey looked at the table. Gerald Pham responded with a procedural summary of the challenge. He was concise and specific, the way he always was. He noted the failure to initiate probate proceedings. He noted the deed transfers. He noted the structured withdrawals. He spoke for 9 minutes without notes and without hesitation. Then he looked at me and gave the smallest nod. I opened the folder. I did not say anything. I took the document on top and put it on the table and pushed it toward the center, within reach of Judge Swick's clerk. It was the Gloria Fuentes file. The clerk passed it to Judge Swick, who read the cover page, then turned to the second page, then went back to the first page. She did not look up. She read it twice. Bradley Croft's pen stopped moving. My mother's head turned toward Croft. Croft was still looking at the document. He had gone a particular color that I associate with people who have just understood the full dimensions of a situation they thought they controlled. Kelsey's hands, which had been flat on the table, moved to her lap. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the ventilation system cycling on. Judge Swick set the document down. She looked at Bradley Croft. She said, in a tone that was entirely level, "Counselor, are you aware that your firm prepared documents for the estate of Gloria Fuentes in 2017 and that the beneficiary structure of that estate was altered 6 weeks before Mrs. Fuentes' death in a manner functionally identical to the alterations we are examining today?" Croft said, "Your Honor, I would need to review the document before I could comment." Judge Swick said, "It appears to have your notarization on it." Nobody at the other end of the table said anything. Gerald Pham placed the transfer records on the table. 17 transfers, documented, dated, each just under the federal reporting threshold. He placed Patricia Odom's diary beside them, flagged to the October 19th entry. He placed the LLC registration for KD Property Holdings, showing the formation date 6 weeks before the first property transfer. My mother looked at the diary. I watched her recognize what it was. The cream blazer, the hair, the prepared composure, all of it held for another 3 seconds. And then she said, to no one specifically, Judge Swick looked at her over the documents. I said, I had been thinking about that sentence for 11 weeks. I said it quietly, the way you say something you do not need to raise your voice for. My mother did not respond. She was looking at a point somewhere past my left shoulder. Judge Swick reviewed the full evidence package for 17 minutes. The room stayed quiet. At one point, someone's phone buzzed on the other side of the table, and nobody moved to answer it. Then Judge Swick set the last document down and said, "The pattern of asset transfers in this estate is not consistent with lawful administration. The timing of the power of attorney, the LLC formation, the deed transfers, and the structured account withdrawals, taken together with the documentation presented regarding the Fuentes estate, establishes a clear and documented pattern of conduct. I am referring this matter to the Arizona Attorney General's Office for investigation into potential elder financial abuse and probate fraud. I am also issuing a freeze on all assets currently held in the name of KD Property Holdings, pending full forensic accounting. Counselor Croft, the Arizona State Bar will be receiving a copy of today's proceedings." She looked at my mother then, just for a moment. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. I stood in the parking garage afterward for a while. Gerald Pham had gone to file the post-hearing paperwork. Renata Osei had stayed inside to speak with the court clerk. I stood next to my rental car in the concrete quiet, and I thought about nothing for approximately 2 minutes, which is a thing I had not done in 11 weeks. Then I took out my phone and looked at my father's photograph. I put my phone in my pocket and I got in the car. The forensic accounting took 7 months. KD Property Holdings was liquidated by court order. The Scottsdale bank account was frozen and audited. $4,860,000 was recovered and returned to the estate. The remainder, representing funds already spent, became the subject of a civil judgment against my mother and Kelsey jointly. Bradley Croft surrendered his law license in lieu of a state bar disciplinary hearing. The Attorney General filed criminal charges for elder financial abuse and probate fraud in the spring of 2023. My mother accepted a plea agreement. She received 30 months of supervised probation, mandatory financial restitution, and is prohibited from serving as executor or power of attorney for any individual in the state of Arizona for the rest of her life. Kelsey received a deferred prosecution agreement contingent on full cooperation and restitution. They were not in the Maldives when any of this happened. They had come home in March. 3 weeks after the hearing, Kelsey called me. I almost did not pick up. I did. She said, quote, 31. I said, quote, 32. There was a pause that told me she had not believed her completely and had chosen to go forward anyway. She said, quote, 33. I said, quote, 34. She said, quote, 35. I said, quote, 36. I did not say that it was all right. It was not all right, and she knew it was not all right, and we both let that sit between us without pretending otherwise. That was the most honest conversation Kelsey and I have ever had. We have not spoken since. Renata Osei called me the evening after the forensic accounting was finalized. She said, quote, 37. I said, quote, 38. She said, quote, 39. I could hear her smiling when she said it. I thanked her, specifically and completely, the way she had taught me to do things. She told me to buy something I did not need with the first $1,000 of the recovered funds. I told her I would think about it. She said thinking about it was not the assignment. I bought a new camping tent. That was almost 2 years ago now. I am stationed at Fort Campbell still, though my assignment has changed. I am a senior non-commissioned officer now, which means I spend more of my time with paperwork than I used to, and I have started to understand why my father found comfort in keeping records. Tuesday mornings, I wake up at 5:15, which has been my internal clock for so long I do not need an alarm. And I make coffee in the small pot on the counter of my on-post housing unit, and I sit for 20 minutes before I do anything else. That is new. I did not do that before any of this happened. The legal pads are still in a box in my garage. 63 of them. I have not decided what to do with them. For now, I leave them where they are. My mother's probationary conditions include quarterly check-ins with a court-appointed financial monitor. I do not know how she spends her Tuesdays. I have not thought about it very much. Kelsey is in Scottsdale. The boyfriend became the husband, apparently. Gerald Pham sent me a card at the holidays and mentioned it in a postscript, the way you include something you are not sure is welcome, but decide to include anyway. I appreciated that. What I kept from all of it is harder to name than I expected. Not the money, though the money is mine now, properly and legally, and finally mine. Not the legal outcome, though I am glad for it. I kept Patricia Odom's diary. I asked her if I could have the original, and she sent it to me without hesitation. The full 11 pages in their blue ink, the handwriting of a woman who had paid attention because she believed paying attention was the decent thing to do. I have it in the same box as the legal pads. Those two things feel like they belong together. What I actually learned, and this took me the better part of a year to land on, is that the people who steal from you are almost never the people you imagined capable of it. They are the people who were present when you were not, who told themselves a story about deserving, who found a mechanism, and who believed that absence was the same as consent. My mother did not think of herself as someone stealing from her daughter. She thought of herself as someone making a practical decision about people who were actually there. That is not a justification. It is just a thing I understand now that I did not understand before. And understanding it makes me less angry, which was not the outcome I expected. The photograph of my father is still on my nightstand. He is still squinting at the compass in the White Mountains, still not entirely trusting it. I have looked at that photograph almost every day for the past 12 years. There is one more thing I have not told you yet. A few months after everything was settled, I drove up to Flagstaff, and I walked the trail we used to hike when I was a kid, the one that goes up past the snow bowl and comes out at a ridge where you can see the whole valley. I had not been up there since I was 17. It took me 2 hours, and I was alone the whole time, and when I got to the top, I sat down, and I ate a sandwich I had packed, and I looked at the valley for a while. It was a Tuesday. My father would have had something to say about that. He would have said it quickly and without decoration. And it would have been true. The legal pad on my kitchen counter has 31 entries in it so far. I started it in September. If any of this sounds familiar to you, I would want to hear about it in the comments. And if you want to know what happened when the Attorney General's case went to its final hearing, there is more to this story.